Hello there, welcome to The Minefield, a show where we try to negotiate the ethical and moral dilemmas of modern life. Walid Ali is my name. Scott Stevens is my co-host. And Scott, I feel like we have to begin today with about 1,000 disclaimers. Should I begin? Or
yes, please, go.
Should you? It's a very serious show. That is not why my voice has descended however many notes, however many semitones it has. I'm not sick. I have negative for COVID-19. I have tested and everything, and I feel okay. But you know when you get sick, but your voice doesn't catch up to the recovery? I haven't explained that well, have I, Scott? You know what I mean, though, right?
You're feeling better than you sound.
Yeah, and I definitely don't have COVID. There is no biosecurity breach that's going on here. But I think it's, do you know what? This might sound silly to identify, to fixate on, but I think it's important because I feel like there'll be people in the audience for whom they'll say, what example are you setting? We're in the context of a pandemic, so on and so forth. And I fully respect that. But I just think it's worth making it clear.
Can I just say all the things that we didn't think we would have to say 1 year ago?
I know, isn't it amazing? It is. But anyway, so I will sound like this for a little while, but fear not. I will definitely not be putting anyone at risk with my conduct. The other thing we should say is that today's topic we've spoken off air, Scott, about doing for quite a long time. We sort of realised that it was becoming an inevitable thing to do a show on broadly this area, but things kept evolving so quickly, and in fact the way that this show works, that it's broadcast multiple times on RN and as a podcast, it may well be that as you listen to this, facts have emerged that didn't exist at the time that I'm speaking these words and that we are doing this show. So that's all worth bearing in mind. And also, we've been grappling, I think, with just the thorny impossibility of doing a show like this well, given the topic that we're looking at is so grave and so heavy. And I would venture to suggest it has been quite badly done in a lot of ways in the public discourse, and it's entirely possible that we do it badly as well, and we're trying very hard not to. But I think it's worth setting out that context for this show before we begin setting out the context of the issue or the topic that we're going to look at. What do you think?
I think that's very nicely put. So let's just say right up front that we want to talk about some of the things that have been transpiring in Canberra over about the last 3 to 4 weeks. Maybe it goes on a little bit before that, but you could say that the pressure has been steadily building over the last 3 to 4 weeks. I think it's also worth acknowledging, Walid. Anybody who listens to this show will know what the two of us think about social media. Anybody who listens regularly to the show will also realize that neither Walid nor I are consumers. Sort of incidental consumers of social media, but not regular consumers. I think one of the really interesting things for me about what's been going on, especially in the last week and a half, is that it's almost like you have 4 different conversations going on all at once. There is a highly prudential conversation taking place among those people who are legally trained, who are legal theorists, and who have some very keen sense, but also the proper degree of legal prudence surrounding what can and should not be discussed, about the role of, I think it's probably not too kind of egregious to say, the role of emotion in the way that we think about and apportion and moderate our expectations of what can be delivered in the name of justice. So there's that conversation. It's been remarkable to me, Willie, I don't know if you've been struck by the same thing, how few lawyers or legally trained persons or law professors have been prepared to weigh in publicly, except in certain matters, I think, of procedure and precedent and expectation. That is really, really instructive to me.
Yeah, and we're very fortunate we've managed to find one, to speak to us today, because we feel like we need that kind of guidance.
That's right.
And the corollary of what you're saying is that the space has been filled, and boy, has it been filled.
Has it been filled?
By people who do not necessarily have that kind of expertise. Now, I should be clear, we're not saying the only voices that should be heard here are lawyers.
No, that's right.
I don't think that's appropriate. I mean, there are questions that are not legal questions to do with political culture, trust between the electorate and the government. And by government, I don't necessarily mean the Morrison government. I mean all of the apparatus.
That's right.
Of government. There are those questions that are not necessarily legal questions, but I do think there is a lot of legal expertise that probably should be brought to bear before we get to that point of discussing those things.
Yeah.
One area I would say we have heard lawyers speak is on the question, which I think forms the central plank of what we want to talk about today, which is on the question of the convening of an independent inquiry, particularly into the allegation against Christian Porter, which is denied about as emphatically as you can, but which nonetheless exists in the ether of our public discourse and surrounds the first law officer of the country. And then the various rule of law arguments that have followed from that, as the government has said that it doesn't want to go down this road, that it would be, this route, that it would set a bad precedent, that it would somehow compromise and violate the rule of law. And you've had one or two lawyers broadly agreeing with that, and you've also had a lot of other lawyers who've been prepared to speak up and say there's no rule of law issue here, here's how something like this might work, and so on. But outside of that, I think you're right. I do think we've been looking at a public discourse where a whole lot of legal terms like rule of law have been thrown around and debated, but not necessarily with the kind of erudition you might hope for. And I'm working on a basic principle that the more emotive it is, perhaps the more restrained we need to be in the way that we opine about it.
Yeah, look, Waleed, I think that's absolutely right. That's not to say, there's no qualification, by the way, there's no but. I think you're absolutely right. And I think if there was ever a way, if there's ever a time, if there's ever an importance for people who are entrusted with the task of, say, cultivating public discourse or of shepherding maybe listeners and the public through very, very, very complex issues, I think that necessary prudence, the real caution when it comes to either inciting or evoking or drawing upon emotion really, really needs to be extremely carefully done. And just to sort of, I guess, fill out what we were talking about before, I mean, there's been the legal discourse, which I think has been limited and properly so. There's been the journalistic discourse, some of which has been exceptional. I think you're absolutely right to say that there really are political and moral considerations here that have been drawn on and discussed with remarkable sophistication, expertise, and responsibility. And then you've got, I think, some less responsible opinion writers who really should have been far more restrained than they have. And then you have the whole undergrowth of social media, which has been completely profligate with facts, conspiracies, names before names were being made public. That's all the stuff that I think is not just harming any proper public discussion of this matter, but it's also the kind of thing where it seems to me that we have a moral responsibility in a very real way not to know certain things. One of my favorite poets, W.H. Auden, said that the problem for an information age, he used the term information age, but he used it back in 1937. He said, the problem with an information age, the moral problem, is going to be to teach people when not to know things, that there comes at a certain point a moral obligation precisely not to know. And it does strike me that when matters of due process, natural justice, when matters of justice are in fact being evoked, there comes upon all of us a very real obligation at precise points. You have an obligation not to go scouring, not to go scrounging, not to know. Wait for things to come out in the proper time and allow certain aspects of this whole matter to play to run its proper course. I should say, though, Willie, all that being said, the emotion that these particular set of events and this most recent allegation against the Attorney General, which again, he is denied in the most emphatic terms I think you can imagine, it has struck me, the emotional force behind it. It's kind of like the pressure, the way that I've been thinking about it, the pressure has been building and building and building for weeks. You could say that it began with Brittany Higgins' disclosures about being sexually assaulted in a minister's office, not by a minister, but in a minister's office in Parliament House, that allegation. You could say it's been building through the series of further allegations that were made by other women against the same alleged man. You could say it's been building through then the steady drumbeat of allegations made against a staffer in the office of the former Liberal MP, Craig Kelly. You could say that it's been building further through this extraordinary archive of thousands of testimonies of sexual assault that have been accumulated by Chanel Condos through an Instagram-based question that she put out, and has created something I think quite remarkable that shows the limits of so much of what we hide behind when we talk about consent education. And then there's the speech at the press club by Australian of the Year, Grace Tame. And then there's General Angus Campbell's advice to young cadets. It's kind of like the pressure has been building and building and building, and the federal government's inadequacy in its response to Brittany Higgins' allegation when it was first made, and then since it's become public, that kind of increased the pressure even further. And then this allegation of a 33-year-old sexual assault that's alleged to have taken place. I guess the way I think of it, it's kind of like a depth charge. And it sets off this vast political, moral, civic set of responses. And it seems to me that for a personal reckoning with what we expect justice might look like, I think there first needs to be a recognition of the emotionally charged context in which we now find ourselves, where for many people there is no capacity, and I'm not saying there's an incapacity, like there's something wrong with this, but there's no capacity, there's no willingness to detach themselves from the emotional content of this, that for very many people, the two figures at the heart of this allegation of sexual assault, the two people are in many ways representative figures. They see these figures and they see themselves, and I think there's something about that, the representative quality, that really needs to very seriously be reckoned with in the way that we imagine what might justice then look like if this thing were to be dealt with properly.
And I would say also the accused take on a representative quality as well. For those that are sympathetic to the accused and those who are not, actually. Perhaps that's the difficulty with what we're looking at here, is that it's so much bigger in the minds of so many than the individual case before us. And perhaps that's why you get the kind of discussion that we are not going to engage in here about the details of the allegation and allegations, I suppose, when you bring in the other examples you've mentioned, and who what's believable and what isn't, and trying to get to the truth. That's not our role. That's not what we're going to do. If that's what you want to hear, find a different radio station or podcast for today, but that's not what we're going to do. But it's important to recognise that stuff is going on, because it does speak to, I suppose, the meaning of these events for our society and for our body politic. Which is to say, part of this conversation is really about a profound, repeated and systemic failure of the criminal justice system with respect to victims of sexual violence. It's a failure that, and I'm really looking forward to seeing if our guest has thoughts on this, and she may not, but it's a failure that is a really wicked problem for the law, because we have a legal system, particularly in the criminal justice system, predicated on a very high standard of proof, beyond reasonable doubt, which is designed specifically to make sure that 1,000 guilty people go free before an innocent person is convicted. That's the idea.
Yeah.
And I think there are very, very good reasons to want to hold on to that. What we're now running into is the limitations of that with respect to a particular class of allegations and offences, whereby, by their very nature, reasonable doubts are very difficult to establish. And here I'm not talking about the Christian Porter case, because it's even more difficult in that sort of case. Right? It's very difficult to prove sexual crimes beyond reasonable doubt in a lot of cases because there are no external witnesses, and so what you end up with is two witnesses who give alternative accounts. How is that not reasonable doubt in a lot of cases? Well, the answer seems to be it is. And that's assuming you've even gotten to the point of police cooperation, proper investigation, and so on. So there is a genuine, perhaps even now it's becoming existential problem for the law and the confidence that the public, and particularly a portion of the public that feels disproportionately let down by the law, has. And I think that's really, really important to reckon with. But the other aspect of it that I think does become particularly relevant in the Christian Porter case is there something that exists beyond the law? And this is where the inquiry, I think, comes into its own. Because the government's reason for not wanting to have this inquiry is there's no case against him. He's innocent until proven guilty. There is no admissible evidence that the police are prepared to go with to prove that he's guilty, ergo he's innocent. And once we start establishing processes, I think I heard one commentator call it a star chamber or something, it's really a way of having a second bite of the cherry to try to convict someone without convicting them. That sidesteps, I think, a really important question here, which is one of civic confidence. So what is the appropriate relationship between the government and between the people? And is there something that is not criminal in nature, not even legal in nature in the technical sense of being justiciable in a court or something like that, and imposing some kind of legal obligation or legal punishment or fine or whatever, but has a quasi-legal character in that it adopts the best legal traditions of fact-finding and establishing of facts, evidence, and so on, but is directed to a different question, a civic question about the propriety for office of the people who rule over us, and in Christian Porter's case specifically, rule over the legal profession.
That's right.
And I will confess, although I do hear the arguments against the inquiry, I don't think they're all terrible arguments, by the way. I know some people do think they're all terrible arguments. I don't think they're all terrible arguments. I will confess I find the call for the inquiry irresistible. And in saying that, I say absolutely nothing about the truth or otherwise of the allegation against Christian Porter. That, for me, does not factor into the question of whether or not we need that inquiry. But then I come to something which maybe we'll talk about later in the show, which is, if we agree an inquiry is needed, what do we actually think will be achieved? And I begin with the premise that what I would hope is achieved is some kind of healing in society where you have so many people so upset for legitimate reasons, and a case that becomes a flashpoint for a lot of that anger, that potentially rocks the confidence of people in the government and the institutions of government. I mean there more than I mean the government that's in power. And that might then allow us, being the electorate, to move on, to say we accept the umpire's decision, whatever that umpire's decision is, and then we move on. That's what I would hope. My concern is that I think we might have reached a point now, if indeed it was ever possible, where that cannot happen. That an inquiry cannot achieve those ends. Because I think, would you disagree with me that this has rapidly escalated to the point of being a culture war?
Yes. Sorry, I don't disagree with you. Yes, I believe that it has. And unfortunately, because of the nature of the capital J justice that is being sought here, I would say on both sides, but maybe sort of one side.
It's especially sharp on the side of those who claim the failure of the justice system with respect to sexual abuse.
That's right. But precisely because of the capital J nature of the justice being sought, I think the time frame that an independent inquiry would necessitate in order for it to be done properly, and the confidential nature of the independent inquiry for it to be done properly. I mean, neither of those things are going to be satisfactory to those who are seeking capital J justice. Can I mention one thing though? I'm really, really eager for us to bring in our guest, but I think there's one thing here that's, I think, further that's further important, in addition to the arguments that you just made for why an independent inquiry is irresistible. Immanuel Kant, who is a figure who's not ordinarily brought up in these sort of contexts, he was particularly sensitive to any act on the part of public figures, and by those public figures he included, say, journalists, people who are responsible for, he actually tends to use the Latin term for sort of propagation, sort of propagating certain things. He says the act of public figures in propagating certain material that leads the public to find those in representative positions and to hold them in contempt. Because he says as soon as you have a kind of break of trust with a representative figure, the break of trust with that representative figure cannot help but have knock-on effects to other similarly representative figures. And once you then have the breakdown of that position of trust or faith in public figures, once the relationship between the public and those in representative positions becomes one of contempt, he says then essentially the very fabric of our common life begins to unravel. And it just strikes me that so many of the arguments that the Prime Minister in particular has been giving for why an independent inquiry would not be appropriate. There needs to be one standard of law for all Australians and not two standards of law. I think what that actually misses is the representative nature, not just of a particular parliamentary figure, but of a senior parliamentary figure and one moreover responsible for legal prudence in this nation. I think that makes the need for there to be a reinstatement or a kind of cultivation of faith between the public and that person all the more important, all the more morally necessary. The other thing, though, Willie, that we're maybe sort of stepping over just a little bit here. What an independent inquiry does, even though it's going to be confidential, even though it will no doubt take time, the other thing that does is it recognizes that while alleged sexual assaults are private in their nature, and therefore in some respect they're utterly unlike, say, an act of racial violence, which is public in its nature and it's communicative in its nature. It's meant to be something that is an act, if you like, of communicative terror in the sense that it communicates to others. This is what happens if you do what this person has done. As soon as an allegation of sexual assault, which is private by its nature, becomes public, that nonetheless, I'm trying to be very cautious in saying this, that has a terrorizing effect on those who then see themselves in the alleged victim's position or as liable to suffering the same assault.
Yeah, because they may well see it as deeply communicative.
Precisely. And so then when you have that moment becoming public, when you have that voice, even if it's a mediated voice speaking, for that then voice not to be registered by our official means of communication, recognition, and justice, that then has a further terrorizing effect. So in other words, there's, instead of the contempt being conveyed by the public to the representative figures, it's almost like contempt from the representative institutions back to the public.
So, or that section of the public.
Or that section
feels that down.
Yeah, precisely.
Right. Which is why I run into the conundrum when I game this out in my head. There's an inquiry. Let's assume, for the sake of the thought experiment, the inquiry finds in Christian Porter's favour. What then?
Yeah.
And I think even though I think the inquiry has to happen, I worry about that. Because if you've gone into the inquiry looking for that sacrifice, looking for a head on a spike, then that will not satisfy you. And if you've gone into that inquiry thinking the problem is the legal system is gamed against women and victims of sexual assault, then any verdict that comes back in favour of an alleged perpetrator, however sound that verdict might be legally on the merits of that particular case, I fear it becomes yet more evidence of that position.
Yes, I think that's right, Waleed, but I think the worst of all worlds is for there simply to be legal silence.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Which is there is no New South Wales police investigation. The case is closed.
Natural South Australia, maybe that. Yeah,
maybe,
I know something.
Yeah. But for there simply to be silence, I think that is an act of communicative and political and even moral failure on a very, very high level.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that. I just don't think it will solve all of the problems we might be imagining it might. Our guest might disagree with that, though, and I would take her word over mine, and perhaps even yours, Scott. So let's speak to her. This is The Minefield. You can listen to the show on RN. You might be doing that right now, but the show exists as a podcast, so you can listen to it anytime you like. You can do that via the ABC Listen app, or you can follow The Minefield and subscribe to it on your podcast platform of choice.
We are particularly grateful to our guests today, not just because we are both a little bit at sea, we're floundering, but also because, well, our guest is not only sort of expert at the highest levels, but this is not something that legal theorists and professors of public law tend to do. So we're all the more grateful to Roslyn Dixon for joining us. She's Professor of Law and Director of the Gilbert Tobin Centre of Public Law at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Roslyn, thank you so much for coming on The Minefield.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, look, I'm not going to put a question to you. You've heard us trying to get a sense of where we are, about some of the legal, maybe some of the political, certainly some of the moral considerations at play here. You've also heard politicians speak over the course of the last week and a half about why an independent inquiry would be an uneven application of the law, which is supposed to apply equally to all. Do you think that an independent inquiry is both, say, legally, politically, morally necessary here? Or do you think that maybe some of the objections that have been raised to it really ought to be given more credence than they've been given?
Well, it's been a very interesting discussion that you've had, and I agree with a lot of what you've said, although I have some disagreements. Let me talk a little bit about why I think, like both of you, an inquiry is justified and what I think it could realistically be expected to achieve. On the why question, I do think, as Waleed beautifully put it, it's a question of civic confidence. And the Attorney General has a unique position in our constitutional system as the nation's chief law officer. And I think in those circumstances, you can talk about Immanuel Kant, you can talk about, notions of confidence in democratic government, but we do need to feel that these issues have been appropriately investigated and ventilated in order to have confidence. And I think that's the real reason for pursuing this. As to the specifics, I also think it is worth noting that the police's investigation did not have the same opportunity in the specifics of the Porter matter to conclude itself in the ordinary way. Because the complainant took her own life, it is my understanding that the police didn't then fully have the opportunity to speak with her, and certainly didn't even speak to the attorney. And so there are some unique circumstances about this which would make it extremely difficult for any criminal prosecution, but which also mean that the affairs involved weren't ever fully ventilated or investigated in the way that there might be an expectation of in other circumstances of alleged criminality. So I think there's both a civic confidence point, and there's something about the particularities of this case that make criminal prosecution uniquely unsuitable and unlikely, and yet mean that there hasn't been a sufficient investigation for civic confidence to be restored. Now, Waleed says an investigation seems justified and appropriate, but he's worried that it can never achieve its aims. But I think that's a very valid point. But I'd say two things. I think an investigation is in some ways about a desire for substantive justice, and those desires may not be satisfied. But it's also about a desire for procedural justice and what people often call a right to be heard. I was so struck when the George Pell appeal in the High Court was heard and Cardinal Pell's conviction was overturned, hearing from the alleged victim in that case that he felt nonetheless that his case had been taken seriously and that he'd been heard. And there's very good social science evidence that people feel that when they've been heard properly, it's easier to heal and move on. And I think for the women and men of Australia who've experienced sexual violence, feeling that when you do make a complaint, it is taken seriously and pursued to the fullest extent possible, even if that can't because of the challenges, relate about weighing up different competing accounts, can't lead to conviction. It can still lead to healing and a sense of dignity and respect that's very, very powerful. And it sends a signal of seriousness about if you speak up, you will be heard. So I'm much more optimistic than you relate that it can lead to positive outcomes, even if the inquiry were to find that on a balance of probabilities, Mr. Porter is able to continue in office.
So can I pick up there, Scott?
Please do.
So I completely agree with you, Roslyn, about the importance of procedural justice and that sense of, in fact, in some ways, that's the argument that the people who are aligning themselves more with Christian Porter are making, is that he's had no natural justice in this. And so, which then raises the question, why wouldn't you want an inquiry? If what you want is natural justice, you can be heard in this way. I think that's absolutely right. And it was impressed upon me, you'll be pleased to know, one of my first ever days in a law firm, the partner said to me, the thing about clients is if they lose, they can cope with that, provided they feel like they've had a fair shot at it.
Yeah, decent hearing.
Yeah. And, coming from a partner in a law firm who would deal with clients that are on the wrong end of things all the time, that, I took that at face value. So I agree with that. The problem I have here is I wonder whether or not that is true of this particular case, because I think what I'm saying is whether or not this will achieve its aims depends on the state that we're in when we enter it, right? It depends on what we are actually looking for when we want this. And if what we're looking for is a way of national healing and a forum being made available, then yes, I think this works out well. My concern is if it's being entered into on the assumption, and I have heard this from some of my female colleagues that I've spoken to and friends, if the assumption is that the system always protects the people at the top of the system, but that's the nature of the failure of the criminal justice system on sexual assault. Now, boys will always protect boys. And even if you have a female judge, I think in a systemic way, they're one of the boys, you know what I mean? Like they represent the system that is being described as, the boys. And then you add to that a process that's in private, which I think it would have to be.
Yeah, I mean, high level, the nature of the investigations conducted should be disclosed, I think, and that a pretty clear summary of what was investigated and how would need to be disclosed for civic confidence, but there would be a strong degree of confidentiality that would be also necessary to encourage people to come forward and protect the rights and interests of both those supporting the complainant and the attorney. I agree with that. Yes. But I do think some disclosure of how and why a conclusion was reached at a high level would be necessary. But I think you're right, Willie, there's a cultural reckoning going on. And if Mr. Porter is found on balance of probabilities not to have committed this act in a way that disqualifies him, I do think there'll be people who are disappointed. And I think that the cultural reckoning has to grapple with that. But I think it's a moment of opportunity to have a national conversation. I do think there's a furor. I do think it's damaging, but I think it's an opportunity as well to recalibrate a bit who we prioritise in these matters. And I think we need to preserve a deep concern for fairness and the accused, but also take seriously the voices of complainants in a systemic way. And I think it's a matter of, shows like this make a contribution to that pushback against unrealistic expectations from those supporting change and say, look, we're going to achieve a great deal with an inquiry, but it won't be everything. And you need to adjust your expectations and see this as only one of many moments or possibilities for intervention, for recalibration and systemic change. And I think that we need to keep our eye on that as well and say to the government, you've always had something of a gender problem in terms of, representation and issues like childcare and the discussion around having a more economically gender balanced budget, investing in childcare and other forms of, preschool and measures like that would be a huge step forward. So would having a national conversation about affirmative consent and education around consent and a curriculum that's a national as well as a state-based reform. So I think that we need to channel some of those aspirations for systemic change into the appropriate outlet. But
Yeah, I'm worried about the inquiry, though, being the outlet for this. And I guess the shorthand of what I'm worried about is that if the result comes back in a way that enough people don't like and viscerally don't like, then the end result is that the inquiry is delegitimised.
That's probably right. But I also think then it's the job of people like me not only to call for the inquiry in the first place, but to explain to people why they have to respect its outcome if it's legitimate and fair. And, it was suggested to me recently, well, Porter's reputation is irreparably damaged. I think that's a very damaging position to get to in a society, that someone's reputation can be damaged simply by the question being raised on social media first and foremost, and or in the mainstream press. People have to have an opportunity to have their reputation restored. And we have to be alive to the idea that there's always doubt on all sides, there's no certainty. And that if people are investigated and the allegations are not found on a balance of probabilities or beyond a reasonable doubt to be substantiated, they have to be entitled to get on with their life and profession and have their reputation restored. And I really think we have to resist the idea that it's over, we can never trust him again. Well, that will be true for some people. But part of our job is to say to people, no, an investigation is designed to provide a right to a hearing and procedural justice for complainants, but also to provide Mr. Porter with the opportunity to answer allegations, do so under oath, to amass any evidence that would support his account, and to restore his reputation if that's something that is capable of being shown under oath on a balance of probabilities to hold up. And it was very, very heartfelt at that press conference. I think a lot of people watching it felt for him and his pain, but some of the things that he said, which should be tested about his memory and his recollection, and the suggestion, I think Julie Bishop was right to question why it is that when the statement seems to have been sent to the Prime Minister's office and been the basis of a conversation between the attorney and the Prime Minister, why it is that they didn't want to inquire as to the specifics. And I think we want to know those things. And I really believe that justice here is very difficult to achieve, but that it should include the possibility of restoring the attorney's capacity to do his job.
Just one thing I should add, in respect of the allegation against Christian Porter and the full dossier, I have spoken to journalists who've said to me that he actually wants to read it. He's been trying to get hold of it and no one will give it to him for whatever reason I can't discern. I don't know, I can't attest to that as being true on my own steam, but I feel like given that that's been passed on to me by people whose job it is to know, I probably should say it in case that remains relevant. You're listening to The Minefield. Waleed Ali is my name, Scott Stevens, my co-host. Our guest today is Roslyn Dixon, who's Professor of Law and Director of the Gilbert and Tobin Centre of Public Law at the University of New South Wales. Scott, apologies, I've been a bit of a hog.
No, this has been a legal training for me, or legal education all crammed into about 15 minutes. I'm very, very grateful to you both. Look, just two quick things. I have a question for both of you. But just before going any further, we should point out that the ABC understands that the complainant did in fact tell New South Wales Police shortly before her death that she did not want the investigation to proceed. Roslyn, it's so wonderful to have your civic optimism on display here. And anybody who listens to this show know that it's something that we hope for as well. I mean, acts of kind of public condemnation and irreparable exile, I think, are dealt out far too commonly. And so the idea that really the end goal of this, in many respects, should be that people come to accept the outcomes of an independent investigation. I mean, that I think is what we should both hope for, and also those who are in a position to help cultivate such things ought to be cultivating them. The thing that struck me, though, over the last couple of weeks, and you two may disagree with this, and please do tell me if you do, it feels to me that the 14-month-long reckoning that goes by the name of the Me Too movement, or the Me Too moment, that engulfed the United States in particular in 2018, 2019. It feels to me that that has kind of been crammed into effectively 3.5 weeks. There has been an intense reckoning, not just with the government's disparity in gender representation or its policies, but also its frankly inept dealings with the allegations made by Brittany Higgins and other women. I think if the government's approach to that, if its handling with that was more integral and more compassionate and was more credible, then maybe when it comes to the allegation made against Christian Porter, which again he denies, maybe there would be a bit more kind of leeway given. I'm not sure. But what strikes me is that now you have this very, very public moment that is dominated by a very senior judicial figure and a woman who is spoken about in incredibly forthright and glowing terms in terms of her lucidity and her graciousness and her compassion and intelligence. The thing that the immediate analogy, I guess, that comes to mind, and I don't know if you think this is a right analogy, are the hearings that took place into Brett Kavanaugh, who was then nominated for the U.S. Supreme Court, and the testimony that was then provided by Christine Blasey Ford. You would have to say that in terms of a public investigation, a fairly good public investigation was done. There was an FBI investigation. There were 2 days of public hearings in which both the alleged victim and the alleged perpetrator were questioned. The result was, we all know what the result was. There was no public confidence, though, that found that the FBI investigation was credible or that the decision arrived at by the U.S. Senate, by the hearing committee, was in fact credible. This is, I guess, what leads me to suspect or to fear that because we've had a kind of Australian Me Too movement or moment packed into 3.5 weeks, because this has been elevated to what Wally describes as a kind of culture war moment, there is no way of cutting diagonally across the partisan divide here. And that whatever the result is, it's going to be a deeply polarizing result because neither side is going to have any confidence in either the motivations or the integrity of the process, whether it be a media-driven process or an independent inquiry process that's seen it through to the end. Roslyn, do you really feel that we are entitled to the optimism that you expressed before?
Well, I think optimism is a good human trait, and I always aspire to hold on to it, whether or not the facts are strongly in favour or not. Let me try and tell you a story, though, about the Kavanaugh analogy, which is basis for optimism. Justice Kavanaugh is seated on the US Supreme Court. The process was not perfect, but it was certainly better than none. It was a significant improvement on the way in which the allegations against Justice Thomas were handled in, 20 years ago. And, the allegations were taken pretty seriously, and it sparked a national conversation in the United States about alcohol, teenage sexual assault, about the capacity for redemption, memory, belief, and a whole set of positive things. And so it shows to me that, it is possible for someone to go on and serve in high public office even when doubts remain in the minds of many when there's been a proper process. So I think it should give Mr. Porter confidence that should he subject himself to this kind of inquiry on the Prime Minister's recommendation and decision, that there would be the possibility for continued high service. And the second thing is, I think a particular context of the US is important to explain to listeners. One of the reasons there was very high distrust in the result in the United States is that President Trump was seen to be rushing the appointment through and to be putting pressure on the Senate to conclude its process in a way that was too rushed. And I think that the partisan conflict here is much less intense generally, and certainly in relation to these kinds of issues. I don't think, Walid, it's a culture war, actually. I think it's a war that is about a certain kind of norm around fairness, male reputation, and, sort of patriarchal power versus a feminist movement seeking a recalibration. But I don't think it's actually a left-right difference, pure and simple. I think there have been voices on the conservative side of politics who've been brave and stood up for the value, of an independent inquiry for the complainant. There are people supporting the complainant story who come from both sides of politics. So I think there's definitely a kind of Me Too reckoning going on here. I like the idea that it's, we're doing it in 3 weeks and the US did it in 14 months, but I do think you're right to say it's a coalescence of voices and calls for change. But the Kavanaugh experience is both concerning, but it also shows that even a pretty imperfect process can allow at least some people to move on, and it is peculiarly inflected by partisan contestation in the US that we have the good fortune to have a more moderate and less hyper-partisan environment on these issues. And so I don't think it should be cause for pessimism, even though it is a salutary lesson.
Can I just take one step to the side and ask maybe the biggest question of all here, Roslyn, in the time that we have? I just want your legal expertise here. Can you envisage what a solution to this wicked problem for the law might look like when it comes to the evidentiary burden precluding, in a sort of structural way, justice for victims of sexual assault?
Well, I think it's a really important question, and I think it's great you're asking it, because I think, as you said at the beginning of the show, the real thing we should be doing here is looking for how to make things better in the future, which is, no one's going to be perfectly happy with what happens on the specifics, but we can use it as a moment to make things better for our friends, ourselves, our daughters, our cousins, our colleagues in the future. So I do think that the criminal law can be improved. And I think that that's procedural. I think it's how we treat victims when they come forward, that they have the right support when they go to the police station and the hospital, people who are trained and, dedicated teams to deal with sexual assault complainants, that when they go through the criminal justice process, prosecutors are trained to handle matters appropriately, and that the law doesn't unfairly prejudice jury outcomes against complainants. And there are a range of really important reforms that have been achieved in the last decade that have helped that. I still think the law of so-called affirmative consent that requires an affirmative yes, not just the absence of a no or a reasonable belief of yes, in order to get acquittal would be a positive step. But the ultimate analysis is that there will be cases where reasonable doubt exists and someone will be acquitted in a way that's really tough for a complainant. But that's the nature of our system. But one of the first academic pieces I wrote a long time ago was about rape as a war crime. And the point I made there was that justice is multiple. It's not just criminal justice, it's justice for complainants or victims, which can involve civil proceedings, which could involve compensation, restitution, counselling, but acknowledgement and the right to be heard. And we've heard in the child sex abuse context how important the Royal Commission and that process of listening and healing has been. And I think civil proceedings are an important adjunct and addition to the criminal justice system for complainants. Often complainants aren't looking for punitive consequences. They're looking for protection and recognition, although sometimes both. And I think that's really important to stress. And it's why it's disappointing that the discourse about the rule of law doesn't recognise the idea that law has a protective function as well as a punitive function. And what's being sought here is about civic confidence and protection, not about punishment per se. So I do think that part of the solution is criminal justice reform, accepting that sometimes that will lead to type 1 and type 2 errors, wrongful conviction, but most often acquittal where a complainant has a genuine basis for complaint, and that we can complement the criminal law via appropriate civil mechanisms in the defence forces at work, and in this case in Parliament, to handle allegations that are serious but can't meet the criminal standard. I think it's understandable that men and women, but especially men, fear the idea that out of nowhere could come a complaint not taken through the police that would have serious consequences for their career. I relate to that. I think it's valid. And I think the threshold should be a serious and credible allegation. But it would be much better for everyone if there was a complaints body that could hear that confidentially rather than a kind of Twitter trial that is not fair to anyone. So I'm very optimistic that a mix of civil and criminal mechanisms can advance us substantially from where we are and where we have been, although it will never be perfect. Because as you said, Willie, there's a kind of irreconcilability to people's experiences and priorities, but I think we could do much better. And part of the way we do it is we have a mix of criminal and civil mechanisms, and civil mechanisms that fit the context. And here that means confidential integrity and complaints type mechanisms in a parliamentary context.
Or civil action. As you were talking, I was reminded of a couple of things. One is the development of female-staffed police stations in Argentina, which I understand has been, I'm far from an expert on this, but I've spoken to an academic who is. He said it's actually had a remarkable impact on gender violence in Argentina. So it's not about changing the courts, it's about changing the process on the way. So,
and I think hospitals, police stations,
yeah,
how we educate people from the beginning around sex and consent, and then supporting victims. And as I said, just think back to that Pell complainant. If you cannot get a conviction that you feel that, as your partner in your law firm said on day one, you had a fair shake at it and a fair hearing, I still think that has healing value as well as trauma. And you have to accept that, that's the nature of a fair process, is that you can't always have your account vindicated, but you just ask to be treated with dignity and respect and to have a fair shot at it.
And then the other one I thought of, Scott, you might like this or not, is the O.J. Simpson case. So he's acquitted, but he is successfully sued at the civil standard for the crime that couldn't be proven of killing his wife. I don't know. How many people have been sued for sexual assault?
Not very many. So there's a really interesting statute in the United States called the Violence Against Women Act, which has been a really polarising but important act that does allow for it. And some listeners may be aware that there was a moment in, the last 10, 20 years in the US where the Alien Tort Statute was used in New York to sue for international crimes of this kind. Catherine McKinnon, the well-known feminist legal theorist and activist, was involved in that. So there have been instances. It's not common in Australia. And obviously in this instance, in relation to the attorney, the complainant, is not situated to bring suit, and there's no suggestion that the family would want to do so. I do think that sometimes that's a kind of backdoor way that's not appropriate. I do think that civil proceedings can be very useful and important in a whole range of regulatory and reform contexts, and to do justice to individuals. But mostly here, people are looking for protection. Women who experience harassment and assault want to be heard and recognised, and they really want to make sure it doesn't happen to other women. And so part of, what Brittany Higgins seems to have wanted from coming forward is to say, enough. We have to do better at protecting young women in Parliament House and make systemic change. And that's the hope, Scott, that the 3.5 weeks of furor will lead to positive steps. And the government, to its credit, has taken some really positive steps to commission some change and think about how to improve. And I think we should commend them for it. But to enjoy confidence, it has to be a holistic response that does whatever is possible while maintaining fairness to all, including those accused.
Wow. We need a sequel, don't we, Scott?
Yes.
So many elements of this. Rosalind, I think we did very, very well being able to get access to you.
Yes, we did.
It's very, very hard to think of anyone who would have been better. So thank you very much for being prepared to stick your head up and talk to us and lend us your expertise tonight. We really appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I don't know why I said tonight. It's not tonight at all. Roslyn Dixon is
do you have another job, Willie? Is there something else?
Maybe I do. It's a tick. Roslyn Dixon is Professor of Law and Director of the Gilbert and Tobin Centre of Public Law at the University of New South Wales. I guess for this week's edition of The Minefield, I hope we did justice to it. If not, we did our best. Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next week.
Well, there you go. Bit slow at the start. They worked their way up to it, but That's an erudite discussion of the issues as perceived about 4 days ago, because I think I first heard that broadcast in the afternoon on Thursday. I have also heard it broadcast at about 2 o'clock in the morning. So this will be its third time being pumped out by Radio National's Australia-wide FM network. I can't get away from the fact that the police say that because the complainant, A, the day before she killed herself, said that she didn't want to proceed with the matter, and B, she's dead, so therefore her complaint died with her because she hadn't already signed it in front of New South Wales detectives, therefore they couldn't act on it. Thus, and because no admissible evidence exists. So a 33-year-old rape complaint falls over and it can't proceed. Yet, if it was a 33-year-old murder case, they wouldn't have a problem with the fact that the victim's dead and can't make a sworn statement. They would proceed on the available evidence. And people have been known to be convicted of murder without their victim making a statement in the court. So it strikes me that there may be some perceptual problem in the minds of the legal, eagle, beagle and briefcase brigade as to what constitutes admissible evidence. Because it seems that they like ruling out a lot of things that appear to be contextually valid factors in assessing what the hell happened. And by the way, here I've got to put in a mea culpa. In my previous video concerning Christian Porter, I stated that because in my experience, the only people who tended to saddle their kid with the name Christian were Catholics or perhaps Pentecostal, evangelistic, extreme fringe suburban Christians. It turns out, no, I was wrong. One of my commenters, thankfully, put me straight on that. Christian Porter is an Anglican. He went to a private school called Hale, Hale. I don't know whether he's a low church Anglican or a high church Anglican. I've had experience of rich kids who go to Anglican private schools. I spent nearly 2 years at De La Salle College, Armidale, which is a working class, blue collar, low cost Catholic boarding school at the time. Closed after the oil shock in 1973-74. But the other boys' boarding school in Armidale was the Armidale School, and it was the only member of the GPS network, or Greater Public Schools, styling themselves after the British concept of a public school, which is actually a private school, full fee paying, and you've got to be really rich to send your kid there. So I've sort of hobnobbed in the opposition uniform in the same university town as people who went to Anglican boarding school or private school. So yeah, I still reckon I'm familiar with the species, the self-entitled teenage chauvinistic individual who sees the world in terms of rugby, football and cricket. So I can kind of vouch for everything else that I said in the previous video, other than the fact that, yeah, he's surprisingly not a Catholic, an Anglican. What's going to eventuate, because we're now, as I said, 4 days down the track, and now there's a bloke who used to be a friend of the lady Kate who made the complaint and then killed herself. I'm not entirely certain whether he was a romantically entangled friend, but he was actually present at the time, and he had conversations with Christian Porter on the night in question and with Kate on the night in question. And he says he's got, vividly clear recollections of the time. And as you would expect, somebody who's on the Australian National High School debating team competing on the international stage at Sydney University, of course he's probably endowed with a good memory. Would have been one of the high points of his teenage experience. Without all of this, what happened to Kate and is Christian Porter the Christian that she recalls and told her sexual assault counsellor about 8 years ago? There were only 2 boys on the team, and one of them was called Christian, and she reckons she was monstered by a boy called Christian. It's not difficult to connect those dots. On the balance of probabilities, if you've got to have an inquiry done on the balance of probabilities rather than proving beyond reasonable doubt, I think perhaps Christian Porter and the Prime Minister don't want to have any kind of inquiry because they fear that the inquiry could reasonably conclude that Kate was probably telling the truth. It's entirely possible that both the pair of them recollect the event in 2 completely different ways, and it's also entirely possible that in the same way that many, many victims of sexual and physical violence functionally recover by completely blanking the memory out of their conscious recollection, and they go for years and years and years and everything's pretty fine, and suddenly something happens. I heard an account by a woman who said she took her daughter to a mother and daughter human reproduction sex education night at school, and it was when she was listening to the presentation to teach her primary school age daughter about consent, that's when she realised that, hey, wow, when she was 14, she was actually raped. And she'd had a termination and kept that secret from her parents because of the shame factor. And yeah, not uncommon for people to go 15, 20, 30 years down the track unconscious of why they're a really tightly strung nervous individual or why they have other difficulties with their interactions with the world. And then something triggers their memory and bang, it all cascades in front of their consciousness. So it's possible that if Christian Porter was indeed the boy who walked the legless drunken Kate back to her room in the accommodation block, and she let him into her room and got herself totally surprised. If his entire experience of the female half of the human race was teenagers who were entirely willing to fall at the feet of a footballer and to catapult from that into having rough, furtive couplings in the dark with no foreplay, if he was used to having people say thank you for that, he may not have interpreted anything that went on as being a rape. If her expectation of what was going to happen was he was going to walk her to her door and maybe come in and perhaps hold hands, have a peck on the cheek and then go away, then she would have interpreted everything entirely differently to the way he interpreted everything. And there's a lovely Latin phrase that the Legal Eagle, Beagle and Briefcase Brigade like to trot out anytime there's a high-priced lawyer defending somebody who would otherwise be deeply in the shit. And it's the phrase of the mens rea, MENS, new word, capital REA, the mens rea. And it boils down to, did the accused have the intention to commit a crime? And by judicious use of that principle, the system is apparently cooked to the point where 90% of rape cases which are brought to court fail. Only 10% of rape cases result in a conviction. So if that's how high the bar has to be to get a rape case across the line, to convince a jury to convict somebody of raping someone, you can pretty well see why the New South Wales police have caved in. And if you look at the way Scott Morrison wanted to take his own personal pastor as a spiritual advisor to accompany him to the White House and have dinner with Prissy Dunce Trump back in the day, and the White House said, no, you can't bring that bloke because his father is a notorious protector of pedophiles in the Pentecostal church, and he's too odious even for Trump's White House staff to stomach the sniff of. Then you can see why Morrison might have been raised to just brush such shit under the carpet, because that's like the ancestral way. That's what's always kind of worked until it didn't work. But by the time it didn't work, he's still role modeled on doing it when he was a little kid, watching his father push all this sort of shit aside and just keep on going, being sanctimonious and telling everybody that God's on your side. You can't see a Pentecostal prime minister wanting to believe that an attorney general called Christian could possibly have done anything wrong, can you? It's going to be completely counterintuitive to the way his head works. At least that would be my expectation. I don't know that it's going to go away. I can't imagine that Christian Porter has got any sort of a future at being re-elected. It's good to hear that he's actually looking for a copy of the lady's 31-page report so that he can see what it is that he's denying with Freudian slips like, did you have sex with anybody on the debating team? Answer, justifiably no, with the ifiably in brackets, because he said just no, and just it's a contraction. It's a contraction of justifiable or justifiably. That's what the word means. So he's saying that he didn't justifiably have sex with anybody. It didn't say that he didn't have sex with anybody. He just implies that whatever sex he had was unjustifiable. So I think somebody's subconscious is working pretty hard at repression and suppression there, but that's just psychobabble analytical guess. But might not be wrong, maybe not entirely. I don't see the issue's going to go away. I think the Liberal Party seems to be rotten with it. And today being Sunday of the 14th of March, and yesterday there was a state election in Western Australia, and the Liberal Party has got voted out to the degree where they've only managed to keep, I think it's 2 seats out of 59. Something like that. The National Party is now the official opposition party in Western Australia. The Liberal Party is just a couple of Fruit Loops who didn't quite get voted out. And strangely enough, this Christian Porter, the accused rapist Attorney General, he sprouted and grew up in Western Australia, and he was fostered and nurtured and gardened and weeded and fertilised by the West Australian Liberal Party because his father was a Liberal Party parliamentarian back when he was going to the private Anglican school learning how to behave. Or not. Maybe how to behave badly, if that's what happened. Who knows? Perhaps the Liberal Party is on a sort of a rotting away slide that'll just proceed across the nation. It's difficult to see how they can rescue their reputation considering the way they're trying to reopen the economy, and they're not quite but almost giving the airlines a commitment to not only subsidise fares to the tune of 50% to certain locations where no doubt Liberal Party donors are having trouble with their tourist investments, but the airlines are demanding that there be a commitment to not suddenly close borders at a couple of days' notice or 1 day's notice, as if the new mutated versions of COVID-19 had not actually appeared on the planet just at the same time that the masking, the social isolation and the lockdowns had put sufficient pressure onto the virus so that it's mutated into, I don't know, 17 different varieties, some of which have hybridized. The latest data on the English version is that it's 65% more deadly and it's 70% easier to catch, maybe 100% easier to catch. The South African and the Brazilian variants, they defeat the human immune system, whether it's the immunity you get from having already had the virus, the actual first version of the virus, or whether it's the immunity you get from having had the vaccine. The vaccines we've got, it's going to take 2 or 3 weeks after your second dose of the vaccine, and you've got to have your second dose 3 weeks as a minimum after the first dose. So you're looking at, you're going to have personal immunity to the virus in 8 weeks' time after your first vaccination. During that time, if you contact the virus, you will incubate the virus, you will shed the virus, you will be contagious with the virus, and you won't know you've got the virus. You'll be an asymptomatic case. So, yeah, it's kind of like the vaccine that you have when you're prepared to continue social isolation and masking and hand washing and travel restrictions and gathering restrictions. You kind of got to continue all of that restriction until 2 months after the entire population has been vaccinated. And that's exactly what the business as usual subcommittee of the Chamber of Commerce doesn't want to hear. They want certainty. They want certainty. They want to be able to profit forecasts, business models. They're not interested in the medical facts of the virus wins every time it gets out of its host and infects somebody else. The only way to kill this pandemic virus is to make sure that every virus dies inside whichever human it gets into without being passed on. And with incubation periods as long as 28 days, it means you've got to get really bloody serious or the virus is just going to beat you. It's just going to beat you. Apparently there's an English variant loose in Brisbane because a doctor who was fully kitted up in the PPE and all the rest of it examined, consulted, treated a couple of people who had the English variant. Now the doctors proved positive within like 36 hours. Really fast sort of physiological response, you know, to be able to breed up enough viruses to be able to trip a test within 36 hours of first coming in contact with it. I suppose it's possible the doctor had already had the virus from 2 or 3 days earlier from some other patient. But the fact is that the PPE failed, means that, you know, maybe it was a surgical mask and not an N95 mask, or more likely, they didn't have somebody who was also fully kitted up in PPE to help the doctor get out of their PPE. Because that's the thing, when you're dealing with a serious bloody virus, it's more dangerous to get out of your contaminated personal protective equipment than it is to do anything while you're wearing it. You put the stuff on in a clean environment, you go into a contaminated environment, then you come out and you have to disrobe without touching the back of your fingernail to your eyeball, kind of thing. Without touching the front of your mask, without touching the front of your gown, without touching the outside of your gloves. It's not easy getting out of contaminated PPE, and a doctor in Brisbane successfully made a mess of it. So 4 hospitals are locked down, and anybody who comes out of Brisbane is supposed to self-isolate if they come to New South Wales. And the airline captains or the airline managing directors are saying, we want a guarantee that when you give us our 50% fare subsidy, you're not going to shut the borders just because somebody gets sick. You know, like, you've got to rely on contact and trace. That's got to do everything. Well, we've only now achieved the level of social isolation, quarantine, personal protective equipment compliance with the private security guards and the police and the army who are looking after the quarantine hotels and the cleaners who are cleaning the quarantine hotels. We're only just a year after COVID sort of burst on the scene. We've come up with the procedures capable of containing the original COVID, and now we're having to deal with something that's kind of twice as bad. like 70% easier to catch and 65% more deadly. Hybridizing with things that defeat the individual immune system's response to the virus. It's not going away anytime soon, and the more people put pressure on governments to reopen the economy, the more you guarantee that you're going to get more and more and more cases, because the virus gets out easy and it spreads real fast, and once it gets into the community, the only thing to stop it is an absolute total bloody lockdown. It took Melbourne 111 days locked down to get over a second wave of the virus caused by quarantine failure, caused by non-compliance of the lower working classes who were employed in the gig economy at below minimum wages with no training and no bloody equipment. The joys of the capitalist economy. The idea that you can reopen the economy because it's not convenient to continue social isolation measures until the vaccine has a chance to work. The idea the vaccine is going to be a magic bullet, stab someone in the arm and they can start going back to the restaurant. That's just going to get humanity's economy destroyed faster, because the virus will blossom and bloom. And there will still be an evolutionary pressure on the virus to keep coming up with workarounds and defeats for whatever response humanity comes up with. And meanwhile, in Australia, I think last week there were 3 black deaths in custody, and I'm pretty sure they were all while in police custody rather than people who were in jails or prisons or remand centres. I think these were sort of in the paddy wagon or the watch house kind of deaths in custody. And we have this rape-tolerant culture in the Liberal Party, and an unwillingness to have any kind of an inquiry because the complaint dies with the rape victim, apparently. Complaint doesn't die with a murder victim, but it does die with a rape victim. And as far as our Liberal Party Prime Minister and his loyalist ministers are concerned, any kind of an inquiry is bound to be an abusive process, and it must be politically motivated, and the facts don't matter. And in fact, the Prime Minister has refused to even read the complaint because his Attorney General, who also has not read the complaint, says that it just, bracket defiably, close bracket, didn't happen. How very convenient. Will the electorate stand still for that? Who bloody knows? An awful lot of people do care, but who knows? Yeah. And more and more people are coming out of the woodwork with what sounds to me like believable first-hand accounts of what this woman said to them and when about what happened to her when she was on the debating team in 1988. And Christian Porter was one of her team members, and they went out and got drunk, and he walked her back to her room. And as I said, back in the day, no did not mean not at all. No meant maybe. No meant later. No meant sort of wait a bit. And that's what the dominant paradigm that was pumped into the teenagers of the 1960s and 70s, and it was on this eastern coast of Australia, so I'm sure on the western coast of Australia it was still happening in the 1980s. That's what the young boys were taught. I'm pretty sure, judging by the number of tabloid newspaper cases and television news reports of bad behaviour by football teams and cricket teams, particularly on what they call team bonding events, and they go away to train in some location hundreds of miles away from where they actually live, and they all live bunk down in one motel together and they all go to a local club and get legless, and the local teeny boppers and wannabe football groupies show up, and quite often after that you wind up with a schoolgirl in the police station in tears and the football club defending all manner of legal and media claims of how badly their young men have been behaving while on their male team bonding event. There's definitely a cultural thing in Australia that was, well, I'd say it was worse back in the day than it is now, but I don't know because I don't get to run around with the teenage boys and the teenage girls, and they don't talk to me about what they do when they're drunk on a Saturday night. They probably talk to each other about it on Facebook, so if you're on social media, you've got a better idea of what's going on in society than I have. But I remember what used to be considered normal, and I don't have any problem at all believing the woman's account of what she remembers happening at the drunken dinner party or after the drunken dinner party. And I can even, at a stretch of the imagination, I can understand why Christian Porter may not remember it. But just because he doesn't remember it doesn't mean that it didn't happen more or less the way she says that it did. Because islands of memory locked up in the hippocampus because they're too traumatic to open, that's par for the course with traumatic events. And I think if you were on the meteoric political career track and you suddenly started going to law school at age 24 and you realised that the way you'd been behaving for the past half dozen or so years was actually legally obnoxious, that might be a traumatic thing, and you might lock it up and just close that door and not think about any of that stuff ever again, because now we're off being sanctimonious and self-righteous and holier than thou because we're going to go out there and redraw the law so that Australia becomes a much more right-wing capitalist Christian neo-fascist society where you can make a profit because you've got the liberty to trash the environment and suppress the working classes or exploit the working classes. Yeah, I can see how somebody on that political track might want not to be able to remember such a thing. And I can see how there's definitely lots of reasons why there probably should be an independent inquiry. Because it is the only way that Christian Porter can ever possibly clear his name. If he doesn't demand such an inquiry and present himself and put his heart on his sleeve and tell the truth as he remembers it, if he doesn't at least do that, then he will go to his grave as being Christian Porter, the accused rapist, because the accusation is going to hang there like a rotting fish around his neck. It's not ever going to go away. The fact that none of it's been examined or tried, none of the evidence has been tried by anybody other than his statement. Didn't happen. That means that the accusation remains. It can't be expunged because he won't let it be examined. I don't see how that's good for him. But the fact that the accusation does hang over his head means that by definition, an accused rapist is not a fit and proper person to be a member of Parliament. And I think the electorate will deal with that one. But I think in the interim, he's not a fit and proper person to be Australia's first law officer of the federal government. I think that's probably self-evident by the fact that he's taken 2 weeks off for mental health leave. And presumably while he's talking to a psychologist or a hypnotherapist or whoever it is who's going to assist him with his recollections, integrations of his memories into day-to-day events. Presumably, he'll be able to at least get a copy of the woman's unsigned complaint to police. I mean, whatever somebody says about him, you'd think that he wants to actually read the complaint. And it's not unfair to consider a refusal to read the complaint to be a very guilty-looking behavioural exhibition. I won't say it proves guilt, but it sure seems to indicate a guilty demeanour, a desire to deny. Presumably rationalisation will be the next ego defence mechanism to be trotted out. Although you could say that the idea that holding an independent inquiry into an unprosecutable accusation of rape would be clearly, according to our Prime Minister, a threat to the rule of law and order. I think that's patent bullshit, and it's a rationalisation. So yeah, we've got rationalisation and denial both going as ego defence mechanisms on the part of the Morrison government. And if you look them up in the psychiatric textbook, you'll find them under ego defence mechanisms, and you'll find that rationalisation and denial are listed as the most pathological two in the textbook. You can't get more pathological than to stand there denying and rationalising a position that is patently absurd, and that's what they're doing. They don't need to have an inquiry because the complaint died with the complainant. Oh, how convenient. How wonderfully convenient. How utterly unsaleable in the electorate to anybody who has daughters. They say that Morrison couldn't understand the Brittany Higgins matter until his wife explained it to him in terms of how would you like it if it was their daughters. And he actually had to be sat down and have that pretty much bullet pointed on a whiteboard for him before he could follow the chain of logic. That it's not acceptable to tell a woman making a rape complaint that this is a political issue which has to be managed. If you go to the police, it'll become untenable for you to keep working in our office. So how about you have a pay rise and work in a different office and just keep your mouth shut, girlie, because that's how we want to manage this. Not until his own daughters were put into the hypothetical frame by his wife did Scott Morrison even start to get his head around that one. I don't believe he regards the Christian Porter matter as anything at all whatsoever other than a political hurdle which he must jump, and he thinks that if he shuts his eyes and runs full speed ahead, he will crash through and everybody will forget about it. The barrier will fall to pieces and some other issue will come up that'll be much more interesting in the press. I don't think it's going to work for him. I really don't think it's going to work for him. I think he's going to do to the federal Liberal Party pretty much what the Western Australian Liberals have done to the state Liberal Party over there. He's going to convince the electorate that they are a bunch of sanctimonious fucking idiots who shouldn't be trusted to drive ducks to water, let alone run the country. So, for whatever it's worth, that's my ideas on it. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.